Welcome back. We are now joined by Megan Ganz, creator and executive producer of the In These Cleats podcast. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. We've been listening to the show from afar, and it's been so wonderful to see such a lighthearted approach on the women's game. But you have to let us know, how did this get started? How did it come about?
Oh, thank you so much. I was approached by my co-producers, Mara Herrera and Rebecca Donahue. They had met Paige Nielsen, who's a starting defender for Angel City. And they came to me and they said, she's so charismatic, she's really funny, she's just natural on screen, and we'd love to do a podcast centered around her. So we went out looking for a co-host for her and found a comedian by the name of Tran, who's an actress and who is a huge soccer fan, and basically started developing this idea of a podcast that was for new fans to the sport, bringing in new people with kind of a lighthearted approach that's good for an introductory lesson in getting into women's soccer.
Megan, this podcast is about women's soccer, but for you, we want to know how you got into it. What drew you to the topics of women's football?
Well, my husband has been into football for a really long time. He actually works for a football team called Wrexham AFC.
Oh, might have heard of him.
And yeah. And so he's been, since we started dating 10 years ago, he's been watching Liverpool games, which is his team prior to Wrexham. And he's been trying to get me into it. And I was starting to get into it through him, but really, after watching the women's game, it just took it to a whole new level for me. I think as a person who works in writing for TV, I love story. And for me, the best stories have really high stakes. And there's just something about the women's game and the fact that they're like, with the NWSL, just trying to keep this league present and at the forefront of people's minds, that feels like there is so much higher stakes for every game that they play. And so I just fell in love with it. And I've been going to games here in LA, the Angel City games. And now, knowing one of the players and kind of hearing what she goes through on a day-to-day basis has just really sucked me in.
If you didn't go to games, Megan, Paige probably would have had something to say about that with her strength, right? She would have rolled her sleeves up and said, I need to get you to games. I love that you talked about...
I'm scared of her. Her biceps are too strong. Impressive.
They are amazing. But one of the best things about podcasts is you get to storytell, and that is one of the loves of what you get to do. What stories have stood out to you so far? And maybe what can fans look forward to as to who you might bring on the podcast coming up?
Yeah, well, we have coming up Clarice Lebion, who is one of Paige's teammates, and she was really interesting hearing her experience being a French player and coming to LA and joining in with this team, and her talking about the differences between the sort of European leagues and the American League and things that she's experienced. So that was a really great interview. During the World Cup, it's been great to focus on the stories. I personally have been just fascinated with Japan's team. I just can't get enough. After the U.S. women's loss, I watched the Japan-Norway game to cheer myself up. Yeah. They're just so exciting to watch. And I have a personal stake in, I've seen June Endo play for Angel City,
yes.
And now she's over there playing for her country. And so I'm fully rooting for Japan. I think that they're just fascinating. Their story, their players, they're just magic to watch.
So you're telling us June Endo is coming up next on the pod when she gets back from this World Cup trip.
All
right, there we go. We got it out there.
Well, Megan,
we actually wrote we actually wrote a fight song for June Endo, and she reposted it and said she really
incredible.
loved it.
That's great.
And so that was really fun.
Oh my gosh. So I was actually college teammates with Paige. So everything you said about her having that charismatic personality, absolutely know all about that. But what has the response been? Because you guys paired Paige with a comedian. What has that been like?
Yeah, it's fantastic. You know, I think their experience has been really great. Tien has been a soccer fan her entire life, and she gets to ask all her burning questions to Paige about what it's like to be a professional athlete. And in exchange, Paige is getting to learn kind of being comedy forward and entertainment forward and things that she doesn't, necessarily practice on a regular basis. But it was funny because after we recorded the first few podcasts, she said she went home and watched them. And then she came back the next time we were recording and she was like, I'm going to be so much better this time. And I was like, oh my God, you're doing
athlete.
the same
Intensity.
thing you do. Yeah, I was like, put me in, coach. I'm ready to go.
Said like a pro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meg, you had mentioned the connection you have with Wrexham, obviously your husband being a prominent feature in it, and then the connection with Rob from you being a writer on Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Could we potentially see you working on a similar project in the NWSL, not with Angel City though?
We want a docuseries.
Oh.
Yes.
That would be amazing. Well, I'm right in thinking there aren't any lower leagues, right, than the NWSL currently, so that you can't like
Coming
promote a
soon.
team up in the same way.
Yeah,
coming soon.
There are leagues within the United States. I don't know if they're professional level, but the thing that is the story about that, right, is promotion relegation. So you need some kind of story about it. But there are some teams for sale in NWSL, so maybe there's a story behind that.
Well, listen, I think I could very easily convince my husband to put a large chunk of our money into football if I really wanted it. He would probably be sooner to do that than buy a house. He is so into the women's league as well. And now that I've been working on this podcast, it's amazing because I was like, I didn't think you could fit any more soccer into your life, but here we are now going to games together all the time. I think the similarity with the Wrexham show is that I really love the way that documentary blends humor with sports. I think they're natural. They go together so well. And I've been really wanting to do that, with the podcast on the women's side, because sometimes women's athletics is just presented as, it's so important. It's really serious that you care about these things. And these women are going through this struggle, which is all really important to talk about. But I think what's getting lost in that conversation is how fun and exciting the games are and how charismatic these athletes are and their stories. And so that's what we're trying to bring within these cleats, is getting to know the women, in these cleats, getting to know the women that are playing this game and seeing the full scope of their personalities. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast.
Love that.
Right now, the World Cup is happening, and you already touched on Japan and June Endo and how fantastic this Japanese side has been during the World Cup. But throughout these matches, these early morning, late nights that you've been up watching these games, have any other nations or players stood out to you as someone you'd like to tap into and talk to, especially on the podcast?
Oh, gosh, I feel like you can't not say Marta. That speech that she gave, I was like, why am I I'm sobbing. I'm rewatching it over and over, just sobbing. It struck something for me personally, working in comedy, where when I entered the industry, certainly there were not as many women as men working, and her talking about not having those idols and how important it is to be seeing people in those positions in order to have the dream that you might one day do that as well. It just struck something in me. So I would absolutely love to have her on the podcast and talk to her. Similarly, Jamaica's team, what a story that is, and for them to, and the footage of the Jamaican players coming up to Marta and after the game and telling her how important she was to them. I would love to have any of them on the podcast to talk about what that experience has been like. It's been a really incredible World Cup. I know it's 32 teams, it's the biggest ever, right? And it's just provided all these stories, these naturally incredible stories. So I'm really excited to keep watching. And the Japan thing, you know, the fact that they're playing Sweden next is really interesting to me, because I think that there's two types of fans when your team loses. There's the type of fan that wants the team that beat you to go all the way, so at least you can say you were beaten by the winners.
Yes.
And then there's the type of fan like me that's like, I want Japan to crush Sweden in the next round because I'm spiteful.
Definitely people on both sides of that. But Megan, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. We look forward to that docuseries on more women's players, you know, that you pitched us here. And if you need any ideas, all of us were previous players, and, you know, just saying, if you wanted to get it in there. Thank you so much,
Great.
Megan.
Well, thank you for having me.